Hi there, I'm Keeva Stratton and welcome to Culture Snap. Today on the show we've got Gill McLaren, a workplace culture and high-performing leadership expert. Gill left a 30-year international strategy career to dive deep into the study of human uniqueness. 8 years ago, her book Think, Plan, Live was released, and it's since become the go-to roadmap for those who want to get the best out of their careers and themselves. These days, Gill is diving even deeper, exploring how our DNA and ancestry shape what she's calling our Unicology. It's a term that captures her social sciences approach to human performance. If you're looking to learn more about how you can better design your life or your career in a way that truly works to your strengths, you're going to enjoy this episode. Gill McLaren, welcome to Culture Snap.
Thanks so much, Keeva. Excited to be here.
So, Gill, you call yourself a life designer. Perhaps explain, to begin with, what is a life designer?
So if you think about we do business plan design, we can do the same guiding principle when it comes to our own life. But if you ask people who do strategy, for example, how much time have you spent on the strategic plan for your own life? Most people would say, what's one of those? And no, I haven't. So it is bringing those principles across from the corporate world, but with a completely different application.
Yeah, I think in strategy, we're always looking at, purpose or vision. So why does the organization exist and where is it going and what values are kind of there to guide it? What does the organization believe in? I imagine the same is true of life design, but perhaps more on an individual level.
There's a lot of similarities to that. So I think about the building blocks and they're in, Think, Plan, Live, behind me there. They're kind of drawn on all those in there. So the building blocks would be fundamentally, who are we? So that would include our value system. You just mentioned value systems there. Values, absolute foundation of your life design. Our strengths, so what we're good at, would be a key component part. And then if we think about the with part of your life design, I would say what gives you energy. So that's people, connections. So those would be some of the foundational aspects of your life design. And the same would be true in a business context. What are we good at? We would focus on amplifying our strengths, for example. So there are some similarities there, quite significant ones really in designing it. But overall, the design job is to really deeply unpack who am I? Who do I like doing it with? Why or your purpose, the where of it, where do I want to be in my life? When do I want to do it? And ultimately, what do I want to do? So those kind of 6 W's that I would have used in a strategic planning framing, I would also use for life design. So it's quite a step-by-step guide, 6 steps to really life design.
I think, those W's are so important. Gill, you mentioned there your book, Think, Plan, Live, which for those listening, if you want to, get more familiar with Gill's work, you'll find it at thinkplanlive.com. I'm a brand strategist, Gill. I love a good DNA story, a good origin story. How does that relate to what we're talking about here in terms of life design?
So before we even get into values, before we get into strengths, all of which are who components, doing a lifeline, literally from your earliest memory to the here and now, and then literally drawing a graph of the highs and lows and just doing a natural flow. This was a high point, this was a low point, and looking at it literally for every age you're at in that journey. And then the pattern part of that is you often, when you look back on that, can see some real patterns in the highs and the lows. So, what brings out the best in you, whether that be when you were a child, there's quite a lot of things that link back to when we're children, but also those same things would emerge later on. The people you're around, what kind of things are you doing? What's energizing? And then the lows often have similar characteristics as well, when we were a bit detached from who we were, or could be health challenges or other things. So yeah, pattern recognition in the highs and the lows, super important. That is the origin story of your life fingerprint.
I love that idea of looking for those patterns and seeing where kind of the highs show up on repeat and, perhaps some of the things that, are lows that kind of come in from time to time. You've mentioned, a life fingerprint. What's a life fingerprint, Gill?
We all know that we've got a fingerprint. So, 8 billion people on the planet, only one of you. We know that fingerprint is unique. I would say your life fingerprint is unique for similar reasons, actually. So, the DNA we were born with, so that's been passed on by two parents, the life experience. So if you look at that origin story and the life that we've lived, no two lives have been the same, the places you've lived, there's so many layers to that, which means our life fingerprint is quite distinct and unique to us. And we need to get to the bottom of our life fingerprint before we can design a life that's true to us. Otherwise, we're overlaying a whole load of shoulds between what someone else's life looks like. So we're kind of comparing it with that rather than if I know myself really deeply and I understand my life fingerprint, then I can design a life that is very purposefully mine rather than what someone else would think is an ideal life.
I think at some point we've all been caught up in the shoulds, right? What other people think we should be, or maybe even what we think we should be. Gill, tell me a little bit about who would benefit from this work.
I think everyone needs it, interestingly, whether we know we need it. I think that tends to be when you get to what I would call a midlife reflection point. Some people could call it a crisis. Ideally, it's not a crisis. It's a reflection point about, is this as good as it gets? Or, what does it really look like for me? Or am I being as purposeful I want? I find the tension tends to appear. Pretty much midlife, you can guarantee it. Many people are getting more curious younger as well. So I'm actually finding I'm doing life design with much younger people now because they're actually asking those more existential questions a little bit earlier. But I can pretty much guarantee at any point in midlife, people go, is this as good as it gets? Is this the best life I could live? It's a pretty much guaranteed trait that people are going to have at that point.
Tell us a little bit, like, what are the benefits that you see when someone starts to align their life around their strengths or their values?
I think for me, life integration, and I almost don't know how to live any other way. So I've almost got to check myself on, the benefits because it's just so natural now. So if you live an integrated life, it's so true to who you are. So what can you expect? Your energy levels are up because you're designing things in energy, not time. You feel in true alignment with yourself. So playing to your value system. So some of those tensions of like not feeling yourself or not feeling like you really belong kind of emerge as well. Amplifying your strengths, way easier to amplify your strengths than obviously think about all the things you're not good at. So if we amplify our strengths, again, we get a much better multiplier from doing that. And then the other big integrators are really purposefully thinking about who really matters in your life. Human connection is so important. And again, from a longevity perspective, human connection is one of the biggest predictors. So purposely designing it with the people you really want in your life, who give you energy, and maybe editing out some of the people that aren't quite so energizing.
Look, one of the tools, Gill, that you've got that I've had the pleasure of having a bit of a play with is, and I'm going to say this wrong, it's the unique operating model or personal operating model. Tell us about that.
Yeah, unique operating model, personal operating model, both of those are good. And the goal of it, and again, it supplemented the book, it came after the book, was the reflection of what does even thriving look like? Could there be a definition of thriving for each person, which then the thriving gets incorporated into your integrated life plan? So yeah, thriving is at the core of the flow of which we do things. Well, how do we even get started on something? How do we amplify our strengths? What conditions do we want to be surrounded by? What are some of the personal enablers of that? And what does it take to be in flow? So it's really a flow model about from end to end. If you got started on something and got something done, what would be your natural inflow thriving? And again, importantly for some of the things we talked about earlier, what's in and also what's out. Are you going to start with big picture brainstorming immersion, or are you going to start with analytics? Are you going to start with bouncing ideas with others, or are you actually wanting some time to think by yourself? And it is a cards-based approach. So a deck of cards, and then you choose the cards that are your highest preference and you leave behind the ones that are your non-preference, and then you put them into a flow. So if you think about the cards you left behind, ideally you're surrounded by people who like those so you don't have to do it. And then if you think about the flow of how you work, then you're in the maximum zone of your energy. So you're literally at that thriving best where you can deliver anything in with what looks like thriving to you. So you're spending time on your greatest strengths, you're using, the energy and getting a multiplier from that. And you're in an environment that accepts that that's how you do things, which is where kind of belonging comes in. So it's a real powerful way of looking at you in the context of what you're surrounded by.
I think it's just so natural for us to assume that everyone thinks the same way we do, or perhaps, likes to work in the same way that we do. We're becoming so much more aware now, Jill, of neurodiversities and really starting to kind of focus in on, I suppose, different ways of work with one another. Can you tell us a little bit, because I know you've done a lot of high performance teamwork, tell me a little bit about some of the benefits of actually mapping those operating models for a team?
I think it really normalizes difference and uniqueness back to if the essence is one of our uniqueness. So as I say, I've seen that in a room where people have mapped out their operating models and then they look around, they go, whoa, yours is so different than mine, and it creates a real curiosity. I find doing values does that as well. So I think it really creates a space to actually explore what makes us uniquely who we are, which is why I'm so passionate about it, because if we're having that conversation, we're not trying to overlay whatever the norm is, because no norm exists. The average person doesn't exist.
Think Plan Live is now 8 years old, and you and I have had some incredible conversations about the work that you've been doing since Think Plan Live. Jill, what have you been up to lately, and what can you share with us about your work?
Yeah, I've been down a few bunny holes on this one, Keeva. I think it's a deeper exploration of uniqueness. So yes, it did start with Think Plan Live. And it did start interesting with the lifeline exercise that we talked earlier, that origin story. I just became increasingly aware, both from my own journey, but also coaching other people, that the depths of our origin story are well in excess of what we know about ourselves. So we follow it deeper into childhood. We can look at parental norms or social norms. We then get into the world of, DNA and epigenetics. So what I've come to coin the phrase of, which I'm exploring right now, is what I'm calling Unicology, which is I suppose, the social science of our uniqueness. So Think Plan Live is definitely part of it and that unique life fingerprint, but I'm increasingly interested in all the layers of that origin story that basically have made us who we are. And Think Plan Live uncovers what I would probably call the outer layer of that origin story, the bit that we know, the lifeline that we can go back to, the highs and lows that we can remember. That all becomes quite vivid. But then I've come to realize that we're not born with, a wiped hard drive at the end of the day. We're actually born with some preloaded settings, which could be a parental overlay or things that happen in childhood that we might not directly remember, or even past ancestral pieces about cultures and norms in previous generations. So that's been the bunny hole I've been down probably for the last couple of years, to go deeper and deeper on that. So Think Plan Live came out, 8 years ago. I've been coaching that for some times. And I've been talking to people, I've come to realize we've all got this deeper origin story. And then I've gone much deeper on mine. I lost my mum and my dad back in 2023. So the need to know the origin story almost exponentially increased at that point. So yeah, I've been in a world of epigenetics, intergenerational knowledge and trauma. There's lots of layers to it.
You and I were having a conversation off air, and you told me that the kind of rings of a tree trunk is probably a better analogy for your current research. So tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Think Plan Live obviously has that fingerprint analogy. And as I was visualizing how it looks like with the world of Unicology, the fingerprint gets transformed to be and look like a tree trunk at the end of the day. So the outer rings are the ones that we can see. It's our most recent knowledge, and that would be the same of a tree. The outer layers are the recent years of growth. If you go in from a tree, and if you cut the tree and look at the different layers, you can actually see, in the case of an oak tree, literally 100 years of growth. So each layer can be significant. So if you work in from what we know, so if the outer layers of our tree trunk are what we know in our own lives, Then the next layer in is childhood. We might have some recollection of that. But honestly, the younger we go, and as babies, we won't remember it. So some of the origin story of that and attachment theory and all those things are very important. And then we go in again to say, okay, I'm really interested in the deeper origin story of both of my parents. Absolutely pivotal. And then we go in again to say, okay, going a couple of 2 or 3 generations back, what were the ancestral stories that came before me? I've come to realize those are all the layers of our tree at the end of the day. We weren't born with as I say, an empty slate on that. We already had many layers already defined, and then we're building the outer layers, but without knowing the foundation, the root system, the layers that were laid down before, we're not getting a complete picture of who we are. So back to understanding our uniqueness is born out of all of that. So if we don't know those earlier layers, some of our sense making is off, so we don't necessarily understand it.
Yeah, wow. This was just mind-blowing to me because I think everything we've learnt about when we study humans, it's really about those kind of first 5 years after birth, that shape us, so very well and so very much. But what you're talking about, Jill, actually goes well before that.
Absolutely. So to start with where you started there, which was like, what's the existing science? Most of that would be anthropology, which is an amazing field. But again, it's working on the law of averages. What does culture have to do with it? What's childhood mean? Those are all averages. So as soon as we move away from talking in averages to talking specifics, which is you as a human, then those other layers really, really matter. So a lot of the research now shows that the first 2000 days are formative, both in the womb. So the time starts ticking, both in the womb and out of it. So that's roughly aged up to 5 years old. But again, we know that cortisol crosses the barrier when we're in the womb. So we know a lot more about the science behind that now and how formative that is. The other stat or thing that blew my mind was that we've existed as an egg since our mum was 5 months old in the womb of our grandmother. So just to get your head around that, the eggs are formed in a fetus at 5 months old. So I've existed since 1932 because that's when my mum was 5 months old in the womb of my. So that's mind blowing. So that's pre-war. That's whatever was going on for my grandmother at the time that happened. Whatever was going on for my grandfather, that was pivotal in the formation of me. So then you kind of go, you don't actually have to go very far back to say, wow, that's hardwiring of epigenetics before you go with any of the more out there versions of what it might look like. So things like that are just astounding when you look at the science behind it now. And there is an art and a science to this, but following that thread of the journey would make so much more sense to say, wow, I really need to know what was going on for my mum, and I really need to know what my grandmother's life looked like at that time. So it's a real history lesson actually as well. It's a really powerful way of looking at things.
Yeah, so for me, this kind of crosses over into that concept of predetermination, that your life is already set, and what you're suggesting is that there's already things that are shaping and forming us well before birth. If Is that the case, or is it more what we're saying here that yes, there are some things that are kind of formed well in advance, or some things that might have impacted how we got here today, but by really doing this deep work and thinking about your strengths and what, your truths are, or the things that you've paid attention to, that you can still form the future that you want to form.
Yeah, the interesting thing is a lot of this, it's kind of, there's still the nature nurture part within all of this. And the genetic material is part of that experience, if that makes sense. So back to the rings of a tree, it is definitely some of our growth layers, but what we make of that, what we then do ourselves, what we overlay and use our strengths for, what our origin story, how we internalize it. There's a lot. It's still a pretty blank canvas. So you kind of go, some of the ingredients are there and the building blocks are there for sure. But we do make a lot of that our own as well. So yeah, definitely not predetermined, even genetic predisposition to disease and things like that, which again, I've been going deeper on. It's only a proportion of the story. It's just saying you might be more predisposed, so you might need to take more action here, but it's still an invitation to action. It's not a set and forget, as in I can do nothing about it. So that's why it's so exciting, is past generational Unicology combined with mine, combined with opportunity. Where do I want to take it? So I think that's exciting.
What do you think you can do with this knowledge, Jill?
Well, first of all, that everyone knowing they've got a Unicology wants to explore it. So I think it's an open invitation. So it, by even becoming a thing, and again, I've started floating the idea with people, and everyone goes, "Oh, I've got a Unicology," and starts telling me their origin story, for example. So if everyone knew their origin story, how can that be anything other than helpful? So I think that's super helpful from that regard, because it tells us more about who we are. So, and if we know more who we are, we can be who we are. We feel like we belong. We're less lonely. So you can extrapolate forward. That can only be a good thing. The other thing, and we started touching on some of the health outcomes related piece, is that we've got those DNA strands, we've got epigenetics overlaid on top, which is some of these ancestral layers and switches kind of laid down. That actually is great for health outcomes, because it's proven now that a lot of those epigenetic switches can link to autoimmune diseases if it's stress related or trauma related. There's a whole range of health benefits to it in terms of understanding that. And then ultimately, if I sum that all up with uniqueness, we're more ourselves. So that means I can integrate a better life. I've got a better understanding of who I really am. I've created this space to be hopefully more curious about other people's uniqueness as well as my own. So for me, there's a lot of layers of benefit. Health is undisputed, deeper origin story undisputed, and then I use that to design a better life. Well, I can only see good coming from that. What do you make of it, Keeva? Like I've just started exploring this. Like, what are some of your key takeaways as you kind of, where do you think this can go in the world?
I love the fact that you can kind of better get to know yourself by doing this work. I'm also really interested in some of the other things that you might be discovering around DNA and what that can tell us in terms of how we can better improve ourselves and things like that. I guess for me, what really is at the core of this is happiness, how to be the most happy that you can be in your life.
I talked about happiness for quite a while, and then I'm probably more connected with joy, because something can be joyful. You can't necessarily be happy or not happy, so, and people kind of go, does money make you happy? Or whereas if you think on deep moments of joy, so it is a blend of happiness and joy in doing that.
Jill, I know you're someone who loves David Attenborough, and I think you just love that sense of discovery and, his kind of anthropology. Where did that love of kind of nature and exploration begin?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of my origin story, interestingly. And I've kind of pursued that. As in, again, I was always a super curious child, as in I was one of those children that asks a lot of questions, which at times was helpful. At other times, I don't think people found it super helpful. But I've always been interested in how the world worked. And again, even going back in my own origin story, um, and even looking at the subjects I chose for A level. Now I'm showing A level because it's back in the UK, but my three subjects together were biology, history, and geography. And I was told that they didn't go together, but they actually went really well together in my head, because, the history of how things work combined with the biology of who we are, and then the geography of where we're coming from, made complete sense to me. And here I am several years later, decades later, in a world of Unicology. So those lenses were already there. And then David Attenborough, I mean, again, I didn't travel much as a kid. We ended up, not going on holiday. I actually only went overseas when I was 18, and I've now been to like 53 countries, probably because I was trying to catch up with that. But as a child, David Attenborough was my window into the world. So I love the fact he was going around the world and, looking at apes in the wild here, and then he's in the middle of the ocean and we're under the sea. I was literally mesmerized by all of that. And I think it was part of the origin of how the world works and how we work, I think was super important. And because I was a bit different, because I asked all those curious questions, I did actually wonder whether I belonged for a long time. So I've been looking at my own origin story, even when it comes to, gosh, Jill, why are you spending your time on unique life fingerprints and 1 in 8 billion and why everyone's got a Unicology? I think a lot of it was about not feeling like I fitted in, like, so my belonging story wasn't great. And I followed my own origin stories of belonging and found many multi-generational lenses. So back to the tree trunk, I have my own narrative on belonging, but whoa, I had a few ancestors back on that one, and my mum and my dad. So I kind of go, wow, I had a preloaded hard drive with a lack of belonging, and then I've added my own layers to it. So that's a good example of how you can pursue your Unicology, because you can actually go back on your own origin story. And I am super curious. So again, other people see this as zero downsides, but again, even the fact that we're doing this podcast and having these explorations, many people explore things that at the time might be really out there or quite challenging, and people go, oh, I don't think that's right, or can you prove it? Or so I love that you're creating a space where people can have these more expansive conversations. But at times, if you're the one person going, hey, I think Unicology is a thing, and other people are going, oh, I don't know that that'll catch on, and what's the big deal with human uniqueness, then you can contract again. So I found over the course of my life, I've both turned the volume up and I've turned the volume down. Kind of go, oh, I don't know that that's going to go well. I'll turn it down, and then I'm having a conversation with Keeva. Hey, let's go up to 10 on Unicology because we're going to have a really progressive conversation on it. So I think it's helpful for anyone to notice that when they're turning that volume dial up and down on Eunice again. So it's deeply part of my origin story. It's the conversations I love having, but I've been through life where I've second guessed that and thought that's going to go down well, and oh no, it won't go down well. So I better kind of assimilate and fit in, and oh no, I can push harder. Oh no, better fit in. So honestly, my lifeline's some zigzags on that one, between, oh yeah, this went really well. Oh no, it didn't go so well. So yeah, a long way of saying this, the thing that it's always been innate within me, but I have second guessed it. So my goal in Unicology is people don't second guess their uniqueness; they just embrace it.
That can be the hardest thing, right? Trying to just fully embrace yourself and be really accepting of who you are, and not try to fit that mold of what perhaps other people might want you to be.
I love the quote, and I can't remember who said it, but comparison is the thief of joy. So I think there's a lot more comparative stuff, and again, uniqueness is all about the non-comparison version of that. But I think today's norms are about comparison, and social media doesn't help that a lot. I'm also wondering with Unicology, I think we're flipping a few epigenetic switches right now. So I think with all that's going on in the world right now, we're probably flipping some epigenetic switches of the past ancestors have encountered something similar. So I think there's a bit of response to that going on, which is where the fear is coming in. So if you think about the layers of the tree, we might have our own fear-based view, but anyone who's got a complex ancestral story, you will be flipping some epigenetic switches on, what this might mean for humanity. So I think that's where fear's coming in. So if I look at some of that with a Unicology lens, and I haven't got the answer to that, I'm just super curious, is the indications are that, we're not just feeling it ourselves, we're actually re-engaging with an origin story that we each may have as well. So that's pretty powerful.
I talk to a lot of people about belonging. It's something that I think that we recognize now that there's a really great need for people to feel that sense of belonging, to feel part of a community, or particularly in a workplace, right? You don't want to feel like you're the odd one out. But what you're talking about, Jill, is really about being yourself and showing up and others accept you however that may be. Tell me a little bit about how you would describe belonging.
Yeah, for me, how I see belonging is when we've got our uniqueness volume turned up to high, um, and acceptance turned up to high as well, if that makes sense. So true belonging is I see you, as in I see you for who you are, and that goes down well around here. That's perfect belonging, if that makes sense. So we're part of something, and that part of something that we are a part of accepts us for who we are. Then you've got belonging. What I notice more is assimilation. So what exists there is I want to belong to this thing. It could be, feel a part of the family, feel a part of work. But to feel a part of that, I'm going to turn my volume down a little bit and my uniqueness down a bit so I fit in. So then we might say, and it's not right down, so we still feel like we belong. So say we've turned our volume dial down to a 5 in our uniqueness. We still lost kind of half of us in that, if that makes sense. But we do feel part of something. So we could be connected by value systems and other things. So we still feel pretty good. But I think it's just noticing where we're turning our volume down to an unhealthy degree where we kind of go, do you know what? I belong to this, but I've lost myself. That's assimilation at the end of the day. That's not where we want to be. So I think that's how I test belonging. And again, it was in my origin story. I had 2 origin story I was working on. I had belonging and freedom, and actually had 3: belonging, freedom, and loneliness. Wow, what a great combo. So I would want to belong to something. So I'd join things, and then I'd go, oh no, this is too much going on. I want to be free from that. So I'd pursue freedom, and then I'd feel a bit lonely because I was free. So I'd then pursue belonging. So I was on this big cycle. I've now found a way that those 3 things happily coexist, because I've kind of cracked the code of me fully being me with having the freedom and autonomy to do what I want to do. And then I don't feel lonely, if that makes sense. But I had them as opposing forces before, because interestingly, my origin stories were a little bit different on each of those. So they weren't actually one origin story. So I think that for me is that belonging definition. So I think I do love this volume dial. And we've said it's not a noisy volume dial. It's the Eunice volume dial. Am I fully myself? Or am I turning the volume down on me to fit in? Then I kind of go, watch that if that's the case, because to fit in, you become less you, and becoming less you is a pathway to loneliness and unhappiness, to be fair. So that would be my take on it. How does that sound, Keeva? Anything resonate or feel differently about that for you?
Well, Jill, as you know, with me, I am, a lawyer, I'm a brand strategist, I can be an MC, and occasionally I think I'm quite funny. So, maybe there's a touch of comedic element there. Probably not. But, I'm obviously a podcast host, and we play all these kind of roles. And I suppose they bring to the fore different aspects of our personality. I'm interested in, how do you be your unique self and show up as 100% you when often, I guess, the environment dictates how we feel we should be?
Absolutely. And again, I know I've talked about a few frameworks that have really talked to me as I've gone through this deeper kind of Unicology journey. You mentioned the word parts. I don't know whether you're familiar. A guy, Dr. Richard Schwartz, created internal family systems and wrote a book called No Bad Parts. But he really lent into the fact that we have got different parts to us. Part of me, might be the outgoing on stage version. Another part of me could be the quiet, reflective person reading a book. And so we can be all those things, and they all do exist inside of us, if that makes sense. So knowing which part is showing up. And some of the parts are set in childhood, to your point. So back to the origin story. Sometimes it is the 5-year-old running the show. So you kind of go, here I am. You can be in your 50s and kind of go, yeah, I've got all this covered. And then, like we still might have the need of approval of the part of us that's the 5-year-old child who just wanted to be seen as doing something good, So back to the layering of our uniqueness is so important, because our origin story gives us some clues to that, to kind of go, who's showing up right now? Is the fully evolved, 50 something, or is it the 5-year-old child who really wants to be loved? So it's an interesting thing that shows up, and his work was quite profound for me in terms of understanding all those parts of us kind of coexist, and we need to almost celebrate each part of us, because it's a layer of a tree at the end of the day. It didn't grow the same way, or some of it's been there for a while and buried, and some of it's been a more recent layer. So yeah, understanding all those parts and celebrating all of them, because we are a blend of so many different things, is really key.
I think, and a lot of the people that I'm talking to on this podcast, they have very different kind of previous careers, and they've done a bit of a pivot and moved into something quite different. And that can also be true of different stages in our life. I know when you leave high school, for instance, many of us like to leave behind perhaps some of the things that we've experienced at high school and allow our university years or whatever comes next to be an opportunity to really lean into who we kind of intentionally want to be. I guess, how do you show up fully as your true self and really embrace this idea of Unicology without erasing, that which has come before?
Yeah, for me, life design is a renovation job rather than a knockdown rebuild. It was a house design job, if that makes sense. So there are so many parts of our life. Back to that lifeline we could do, or re-looking at our value system. I find it's more typical that people lost a part of themselves rather than they need a new part, if that makes sense. So often life design is a reconnection with self, a value system that was perhaps neglected, a love of creativity that was probably there as a child but hasn't seen the light of day ever since. Or so I found it's a much bigger reconnection job, interestingly. So it's I often find people go back to their used to list, because I say, what's your used to list look like? And people go, what's a used to list? I used to enjoy reading a book sitting by the ocean. I used to do yoga every morning. I used to be creative as a child. And they kind of go, would you still love to? They go, oh yeah, I'd love to still be that. And well, you kind of still are that, but we might have neglected it a bit as well. So I think it's a reconnection piece. And then back to the parts that aren't serving as well, there might be parts of it where you kind of go, yeah, I've kind of become this, but that was never really me anyway. I did that to fit in, or I did that. So those are the parts that we can just kind of let go, really, and say, actually, I don't want to take that with me. So but from a life design term, it's almost like what's coming across the line with me, as in I love that part of me and I want to go forward, or I lost that part of me and I want to bring that back. And you know what? There's parts of me doing this right now that I don't really want to take forward anymore. So I think it's a conscious renovation, but the deep connection to self in all of this. So the biggest thing I find people need to suspend is the shoulds, like, well, I should be this, or by this age I should have done that, or I should have had this, or particularly when it comes to possession, the should list is quite high on should do this or should be doing this kind of role. It's like, whoa, hang on a minute. Is there anything in your uniqueness that would suggest that you should be doing that, rather than I have a deep love of this that I'm reconnecting with? So
I mean, Jill, speaking kind of from my own personal experience, I've really enjoyed working through your book, and it's helped me to kind of understand myself in totally different ways and feel quite good about maybe some of the quirkier parts of my personality. But I have to say, obviously, whenever you start to do a bit of work on yourself, it is vulnerable. You've got to confront some of the things that maybe you haven't wished to confront. So, what would you say to people to encourage them to, embrace this kind of work and to not be afraid of what they might discover in the process?
think I think what I've come to find is that we think we know ourselves, but we don't really. I mean, that was my big discovery of going deeper and deeper on from all the way from Think, Plan, Live into the worlds of Unicology. I've almost come to realize I didn't know myself that well, and I've come to realize that people just don't. Like they almost worry about what they'll find, but the only thing they're going to find is themselves, which makes complete sense. So we almost avoid it thinking it's going to be worse than we think it is, when in reality, a reconnection with self is only going to end well, So otherwise, we haven't really processed that. We haven't really thought about the strengths that we could amplify, or the values that are important to us, or what gives us energy. So we haven't really got access to the declutter job because we don't know what's coming across and what's staying behind. But I think there's almost a fear of what we'll find, which is an interesting one, because I've only found people finding things that have been super helpful, if that makes sense. So if anyone's worried about, oh, I don't know what I'll find, you go at your own pace. And if something's a bit daunting, take the lifeline exercise, then don't do the lifeline exercise. If you know there's daunting things in your past, go straight to values, for example. So there's nothing to lose from a self-paced journey where you're in charge and you're calibrating it and you're deciding the pace that you go. Here we are talking about the multi-layers of our ancestors. Don't start there. Okay. So start with your value system. So I think that's what's joyous about it, is the don't make it daunting. Take a step, then learn something else, and then share it and explore it. Because it's actually a beautiful and rewarding journey. I don't know how to live my life any other way now, and I love exploring it with other people. I've loved being on your journey as well. Only joy can come of it once we process some hard stuff that might emerge, but processing it is helpful.
Jill, I love that. And I would absolutely encourage anyone who's thinking about just, if they're not feeling 100% themselves, if they're not feeling like, you're in the right career, or maybe things just aren't working in the way that you'd like, that you get a hold of Jill's book, Think, Plan, Live, which you'll find at thinkplanlive.com, as we mentioned earlier. Jill, I just want to say an enormous thank you for being on Culture Snap today. You are a remarkable woman. You've had the most incredible corporate career, and now I feel like you're just starting to have the impact that you're meant to have. So, congratulations. I think your research is really unique and really interesting, and I'm so looking forward to the next book. Thanks, Jill.
Absolutely. Thinkplanlive.com to find the book, and then you'll find other things from there. And honestly, Keeva, I've loved this conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. So thank you so much for inviting me on. It's been wonderful to talk to you.